Welcome to the D&D Fitness Radio Podcast, brought to you by your hosts, Don Saladino from New York City and Derek Hansen from Vancouver, Canada.
Let's jump into our next topic, which is carbohydrates, which obviously, I mean, they're all kind of tied into each other in a way, right? I mean,
yeah.
But I think the interesting thing about carbs, Derek, is how, and Dr. G, it's how different they could be for different people. And throughout the year, I'm very heavy into carbs. And then there are times I feel like I want to keep my carbs a little bit lower. Dr. G, you're very much more into, I mean, from a personal standpoint, keeping your carbs low.
Yes.
And Derek, I would imagine you're kind of a half and half where you like adjust them at certain times during the day. You probably pay attention or don't you? Do you pay attention to how much carbs you're having during the day? How do you go about doing that?
I think so. And I'd like Dr. G to talk a bit about this, but just the relationship between like just, fluid accumulation, retention, and just, I know that if you take in a certain amount of carbs, you need a certain amount of, fluid to water to help with that process. But I do feel like if I do get a little carb heavy, I feel bloated, or I just feel like, I just don't feel right. So I'm very careful about that. And then, is it the first thing I have in the morning, or do I, diversify it a bit more? But yeah. And again, when I was 30 or 25, whatever, I just ate anything. Right. But now that I'm 50, I really notice these effects. Maybe I'm just smarter, or I'm just grumpy or something, but I don't know. It's different.
I think carbs are an interesting topic. And when you think about it evolutionarily, there's only one. So glucose in and of itself is toxic, right? High levels of glucose is in and of itself toxic. And that's really the definition of diabetes. The body has developed only one way to protect itself from glucose. That's it. It's weird, right? One way, which is insulin, which makes me think we are just not metabolically designed to have a bunch of high glycemic or sugary carbs. Because on the flip side, the body has a whole bunch of mechanisms to protect us from low blood sugar, hypoglycemia. It has multiple mechanisms. So to me, it makes much more sense that if we looked at any macronutrient, the macronutrient that we really want to be tight with would be carbohydrates. Right. And, personally, I think carbohydrates should be thought about is in a meal to meal basis, and just because of that insulin factor, you don't want insulin going up. You'll burn out your pancreas. And we've seen that all over. So, just to give a number, I think keeping carbohydrates 30 grams or less per meal, you really do your body a service. And, guys like you and Don could probably go higher. But I would say for the average population who may not be training intensely, keep it at 30 grams. What do you have to lose? 30 to 40.
It's tough about that too, because when you start lowering carbs, your calories obviously naturally start dropping, right? I mean, it's, if I was to turn around, cut my carbs in half and keep everything else the same, my calories are going to go down, right? So if my calories go down, then I'm going to go into a caloric deficit, which I kind of fight all the time anyway.
Right.
Is that something you think you should be concerned with? Or is it just like keep training and, keep your protein high and keep muscle tissue in check, and maybe we bump the fats up a little bit? Like, how would you go about handling that?
I think that you actually hit upon probably the most important variable for diet. Once the protein is set, which I believe it should be, it's really the manipulation of carbohydrates versus fats. And I think manipulating your carbohydrates is probably the number one thing that you can do to optimize really your body composition and metabolism per se, based on your activity level. You're incredibly active. So for you would do really well bumping up those carbohydrates. You need it and probably function better. But it's that carbohydrate or fat, that's what can be negotiated.
So when the carbs come down, the fat's going to naturally have to come up a bit.
Yeah, because you want to keep your protein steady. I mean, unless you're really doing a protein sparing fast or some kind of medical weight loss or something where you're, or you're competing in a figure competition or some kind of physique competition, then you're essentially doing more of a starvation type diet where you just want to keep your muscle tissue. And that's a temporary kind of a thing.
So, I mean, because fats have 1 gram, what is it? 1 gram of fat has 9 calories, correct?
Yeah. Yep.
1 gram of carbohydrates has 4 calories. So
Yes.
if you're removing, 2 grams of carbohydrates, that's almost to 1 gram of fat, right? I mean, it's almost double the amount of fat.
Totally.
So if you're starting to cut your carbs down drastically, you don't have to bump your fat up as much. It's not from a 1-to-1 ratio, but you're going to have to bring it up a bit.
And then the other thing is, could you increase that protein? So for every 100 grams of protein, your body generates its own glucose, 60 grams of glucose. So I think for me, and we talked about earlier that there's metabolic effects from protein, right? Protein is a way to push your metabolism, ATP generation, laying down tissue. So, if I didn't care about performance per se, and I really wanted to push body composition, but of course there's that performance piece because you want to be able to train hard, I would suggest tinkering with increasing that protein because you'll generate all the glucose you need.
What do you think is a range that you typically keep males and females in when it comes down to gram per pound of body weight for protein? I know this is a carb talk, but they're all related.
Exactly that. So it's about 1 gram per pound ideal body weight, depending on how heavy they are.
For both male and female?
Because it's based on blood volume. Yes, great question. So when you think about protein, you definitely think about lean muscle mass and total body weight. But the sex difference doesn't really matter, So I really encourage people not to think that women, just because they're women, need less protein. A 125-pound woman needs just as much protein as a 125-pound man.
Right. That would make sense. Would you manipulate calories and protein depending on if you need to get that individual into a deficit? So is there like a range? So if you got to get the calories down a little bit, are you maybe bringing someone to 0.75? Or if you need to get their calories up, someone like me who's maybe trying to put size on, I'm not saying I am, but would you maybe get me up to 1.25 or 1.5? Or how are you increasing those calories?
So it's interesting. So for a guy like you, and I think we've done your nutrition before, and I think we keep you at around 250 grams of protein.
Yeah, roughly. And I probably get anywhere from there to 275. Sometimes I'm overhitting.
And you weigh what?
210.
Yeah. So you're a little bit over 1 gram per pound body weight. I like that. And I'm comfortable with that. We've never seen any detrimental effect with protein. But my job is to really make sure people are safe. So I do think when you're talking about 300-400 grams, when you're pushing that, I don't know what those metabolic implications are long-term. I do have some concern, whether that's based in science or not. I just think that, we don't know if you really have to go over that high amount.
You look at a lot of bodybuilders, Derek, who have to start. I know Derek works with a lot of runners, so I'm curious to hear, how their nutrition is. But I know with bodybuilders, especially, a lot of these men and women off season, they're, it's calories. And the one constant that I do see is that at a certain point from eating that much, they almost always sound like they're out of breath. And I'm not saying that's from the protein. That just could be from the overall calories in itself. But, is the human body meant to be digesting, 5,000, 6,000, 8,000 calories a day? I mean, that's a question I have.
Oh, am I? Yeah, I just wanted to chime in. Like, I know.
No, I was asking. What's happened there? Did I just cut out?
No. You're fine. I'll just add something quickly. I know. Did you guys watch the Lance Armstrong ESPN 30 for 30?
Mm-mm.
Oh, it was interesting because they were talking a lot about body weight and how they wanted these guys to really eat less and just drop their body weight because it had a huge influence on obviously the weight and climbs and all that. And I know a lot of distance runners will be very conscious of body weight too. So they will be cutting, carb intake or sorry, even just general food intake for that, just to drop their weight so they have less to carry. But of course, there's going to be issues. I know in female runners, there's a lot of issues around iron deficiencies and then even stress fractures. So I don't know how you would manage that.
You mean iron deficiency, anemia, and stress fractures for women training?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's really tricky because the better the athlete, it's a tremendous amount of stress. And Donna and I were talking about that. There's always a price, right? A price you pay. And, the best thing that you can do is you've got to keep them in a calorie surplus. And the way in which you deal with weight, you just assume that they're well-trained, because when you begin to cut calories and cut nutrients, the activity increases, free radicals and damage and stress to the body. You have to replenish that. You absolutely have to replenish that. Got to make sure protein is high for their bones, for recovery, for healing, and then calories.
Well, there's a lot of coaches I know. Sorry, Don.
No, go.
With all the athletes I've worked with, gymnastics, runners, there's a lot of coaches who weigh their athletes frequently. And obviously there's all sorts of psychological issues around that as well. But how do you help manage that situation too, so that they are getting what they need nutritionally, but they're not over obsessing with like a pound here or a pound there?
It's tricky. It's all mind frame, for them, when it begins to be obsession. And listen, the better you are, the more obsessive you're going to be. And I think that we see that all the time. And I think it's really building a foundation, really understanding who the athlete is or who the patient is and seeing how they process things. I think one of the most valuable aspects is if they have a growth mindset, right? Whether they have a growth or a fixed mindset, where that growth mindset is they're more mentally flexible to maybe that extra weight. And I think that rather than just focusing on the athletic performance, when you really get to the underbelly of the individual and, you can address that, then the coaches or the physicians have so much more flexibility with the individual.
Because there's a huge psychological, mental health component to all of this. Do you find yourself getting into these discussions more and more around diet and nutrition?
All the time. With the SEALs, not so much. So with the military operators, you just give them, hey, you're going to do this. This is what you're going to do. You just have to protect them from themselves because they're kind of hard charging, but I would say for the athletes and other individuals, absolutely, right? Because you can't separate the two. If you could, here's your program, you just execute it. It's not always that way.
Getting back into carbohydrates in reference to consumption. Every GPP, for people coming in to just train and to look better naked and to have optimal levels of energy.
See, the key there is just find a husband who doesn't care. You look good. You look good, Dave, no matter what.
Where do you recommend people to start? So is someone who's not really so in tune with their body, they're saying to themselves, you know what, I'm going to need some carbohydrates in my diet for energy. Green leafy vegetables isn't enough. Yep. I'm going to implement some fruits. But if they're going to get some starches in, like sweet potato or maybe some rices, et cetera, if you recommend that, what time of the day are you telling them to put that in? How much of it do you want them to start with? So
I almost always recommend them not putting it in their first meal of the day. So typically those individuals have some metabolic issues and they don't necessarily have a great capacity to handle their carbohydrates. So by eliminating carbs from their first meal and essentially backloading, you do two things. So number one, you can correct for that meal, right? So if they're insulin resistant or they have trouble with glucose, by adding in fats and proteins that first meal, you're not chasing blood sugar throughout the whole day. And then you can backload your carbohydrates because those individuals then have trained. They've spent the day moving. Their muscles are depleted. So now you're strategically adding in carbohydrates. They're much more likely to be compliant because most people crave that carbohydrate in the evening. So now we're kind of working within their lifestyle. So, the recommended amount of carbohydrates is 130 grams per day. I think that's probably too high. But that's, again, what is recommended, I think, starting at 90 grams and kind of titrating around, depending on what you're doing for activity. So if you're not working out at all, you can start at 90 grams. But then if you're doing more activity, you begin to increase those carbohydrates later on in the day.
Right. It's interesting for athletes, though, because naturally their main focus is performance.
Right.
And it's almost like a catch-22 because an athlete needs carbohydrates, but on the other hand, really can spike your insulin level first thing in the morning. And it can really disrupt training. If you, I always like to say, overfill that gas can. So, are we better off keeping the carbohydrates out first thing in the morning and having good brain function and just backloading it and upping them more so you have enough in your storage when you sleep and when you wake up the next day? And the more I speak to you and the more I experience it, the more I believe that, you are 100% right, where we have to keep them out of that first meal, at least to the point where, if training gets so intense and you just get so depleted that you have to start consuming on that. Is that,
and this is where adding in MCT oil is great. Ketones, MCT oil for that first meal of the day.
Right.
Is really great for brain function.
Right. Awesome. Derek, what about with your runners? Do your runners, like, how nutritionally, how nutritionally based are you in their lives? Is it something where you're just like, listen, make sure you're eating your meals, or, are you trying to put them in the right direction and sit and talk with them a little bit about that?
I would say I had less problems with sprinters. Maybe because they just burn at such a very high rate and it's very intermittent. But I would say for people who are longer distance runners, I was a little more hands-on for, just managing the body weight, making sure they had, a caloric surplus going into the longer bouts of running and all that. But
what kind of stuff, Derek, what kind of carbohydrates did you use?
We were trying to draw on just natural sources for the most part and just looking at their whole food diet. But there were people using, supplemental fuels. Like I can't remember what one was called, but I know there was a group of swimmers I was looking at or working with, and it was called Vitargo or something. There was so they would use that and everybody liked it. So, they thought they got a real benefit from it. So again, I didn't intervene. That I think the club had some sort of special arrangement with the company. And so, but yeah, other than that, I mean, swimmers are a little different animal than say pure sprinters and running, but because there is more of an endurance component in those distances. So it's like 4 times longer. So if you run 100 or swim 100, that's like a 400 in running. So I don't know. I wasn't very hands-on with a lot of it. They always had somebody else involved as well. So, but I did notice the biggest things were the injuries that I was most concerned about that we were talking about before. So whether it was a soft tissue injury or a fracture, like a stress fracture, or like I said, any issues with their blood work. So.
What about, feeding off of Derek's comment there, but carbohydrates and hormone function or carbohydrates and recovery? All right. Is that something someone goes through an injury? Do you keep the carbs up? Do you keep them down? Is it a day-to-day thing? What are they supposed to do?
So, when I think about hormones, I really think about total caloric intake and fat. For guys, if we're really looking at hormone function, I like to keep I don't go below 80 grams of fat per day because, you do require that for hormone production. Depends on what kind of injury, depends on if they're, at bed rest. I think that keeping calories up, because you don't want to move into a catabolic state, right? Injury, bed rest, that's a very catabolic state, broken down state. So really keeping perhaps not a massive surplus, but keeping somewhat of a surplus is going to be beneficial. And there's some great data out of Doug Patton-Jones's lab about injury and bed rest. And it's really about protein and calories.
Interesting. Now, obviously carbohydrates and the types of carbohydrates, incredibly important, something you still value, even if someone has a very fast metabolism or is burning a lot of calories, are they able to kind of bend the rules a little bit more, or do you feel, so they can. So there's just certain, but what about the quality of carbs? So if someone's eating like cereal and it's like a healthy organic cereal, isn't there specific? Well, no, I told you that was 1 week. Maybe more. I'm using that as an example because I have heard of a lot of bodybuilders or a lot of athletes who need to consume a high level of carbohydrates, and to eat sweet potatoes that much, it's going to be, it's impossible. I don't care. I was at a certain point in my life, I was eating 32 ounces of sweet potatoes a day. That's a lot of sweet potato. And my carbs still weren't anywhere near where it needed to be. You had to consume other things. but there's a cost to doing business. If you start overstepping and consuming carbs that don't have that nutritional quality, that affects your body also.
So, I think what you're saying is totally right on. If you can minimize the amount of, say, sugary processed calories, I think that that's best. Really, when I think about it, I don't recommend more than 10% come from that, regardless of what kind of athlete you are. So you've got, maybe if your total calories are, whatever they are, 2,000, maybe 10% of that can come from more sugary stuff, especially if you're very active. I think really thinking about in terms of complex carbs. So, whether you're going to do a rice, if you're really trying to get fast absorbing carbs, you want to do a white rice versus a brown rice. You definitely can eat more. It's not as much fiber, even though there's not a tremendous amount of fiber either way. That's a way to do it. And then, of course, those waxy maize type drinks, that kind of a thing. I really think it's important to balance your meal appropriately, because athletes who are highly active, and let's say you're requiring more carbohydrates, you still don't want to consume carbohydrates alone. Maybe if you're in the middle of a 100-mile run, it's okay, or you're doing something crazy. But really, you do want carbohydrates consumed with some kind of protein or some kind of amino acid.
Why
some
is
kind
that?
of
Can you
mixed meal.
explain?
Yeah, because you don't want to spike your blood sugar. You will spike your insulin. And like I said, the body has one way to deal with high blood sugar, no matter what, right? If you're at rest, the body has one way.
Right.
And that's insulin.
Right.
You don't want to rely on insulin.
Right.
What are the implications for, like, obviously right now in this current situation we're in, people are really concerned about immune function, and inflammation, like whether it's like blood clotting or whatever they're finding now. What are some things that we can do? And is there this connection between gut health and inflammation, and what are the effect of too many carbs or too much glucose in the system?
Metabolic regulation and inflammation, the best thing that you can do for inflammation is to have a good metabolism, is to have good body weight, right? To have a lean physique. The metabolic issues create so many problems. For example, cancer. There are certain types of cancer. Being overweight is a risk factor for cancer. I mean, that's a pretty big deal. So especially in our certain, especially in the current climate, having a healthy body weight and a healthy metabolic profile is the best thing that you can do for immunity. And then when you think about supplementation and feeding the immune system, protein directly feeds cells of the immune system, which is interesting, right? And then you think about gut health with glutamine, also very valuable. Elemental zinc, omegas, vitamin D, these are all aspects that can help augment a healthy immune system. Really staying in a healthy state is your best defense. And really that comes down to metabolic capacity.
Good there. That's pretty awesome. D, any other questions?
No, I'm just happy that, I'm on the path to better body composition and whatever. I mean, this has been a really interesting time for me. So, especially, now that I'm over the 50 hump, I'm thinking
you literally look 10 years younger. I'm staying 29 forever.
Well, you guys both look amazing. D, I mean, you're like living proof pretty much. I mean, you actually did a pretty, I wouldn't say it was a 180, but you really did a reversal, kind of a whole anti-aging thing over the last, 3 to 5 months. I mean, I've seen a big difference in you as well when it comes down to body fat and just even like, how you're carrying weight. It looks completely different. But I think it's a great story, and it's great. It's great motivation for people to understand that it doesn't, because I can't stand that, individuals go, oh, well, I'm getting older. I'm like, well, we're all getting older. Like, it's just, are you going to give up, or are you just going to understand that it might not be as easy when you were 22, but we also have more information now, and we're smarter now. And we can make better decisions than when we were 21. Derek, I'm sure your training right now is a lot better than it was, 25 years ago. I'm not saying it was bad. I know mine's better. You just get smarter, right?
Yeah. I think it's so like there's different ways to push through things, and obviously pushing through and doing excessive volumes and doing excessive intensities of stuff was easy back when I was 20 or 25. But now I'm like, oh, okay, no, I don't want to deal with the consequences. That same with eating. It's just like, what are the consequences? And I start thinking about that more as opposed to like, let's just do it, right? So, I just think you just get a little wiser out of necessity. So. And some people choose not to, but because it is so like Dr. G was saying, like you got to have some sort of mental support around all of this. It's not just I decide to do this and I do it. Like there's, I talk to you guys, I have other people to bounce stuff off of, and you're like, okay, I guess I got to do it. Like I have all the information, but making that decision is very difficult. So
good stuff. Dr. G, can you tell everyone where they can find you if they check you out?
Sure. So I'm very active on Instagram, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, and I just relaunched my website. So actually I have a ton of free material. That's awesome. I updated my Lyon protocol. So all this nutrition stuff and how to calculate what you need to be eating is done, and a couple quizzes and just free information. And I have a YouTube channel. So I spend a lot of time talking about some of the recent studies and just interesting stuff that I think is of value for you guys. So I can send it to that.
Awesome.
I love it. Well, thank you for being on. We definitely have to do this again because I know there's other topics that we're going to want to cover. So hopefully you'd be willing to come on and give us another hour.
Of course.
Have a conversation, which is always
so fun. Yeah.
Derek, great job today as always. Always ask.
Yeah, we'll get this out soon, and I'll be interested to see what feedback we get.
Yeah, me too. And we should touch base early in the week if you got some time. I want to go through some topics and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. A little more time, so get a little more organized, hopefully, with all this stuff.
Great. Thank you very much.
Have a great weekend, guys.
Bye, guys. Okay.